The bandana around Briar Maddox's face had once taken a bullet meant for Nash Hawthorne's heart, and now he was about to trade his life for hers. The dust cloud rose like smoke from hell's own chimney as the Crane gang thundered down Devil's Ridge, their horses' hooves drumming against the hardpan earth. Nash pressed his back against the weathered oak, feeling the bark bite through his shirt. His Colt .45 felt heavy in his grip. 6 bullets against Marlowe Crane's dozen men. The mathematics of death had never looked bleaker. "Come out, Hawthorne." Marlowe's voice cut through the desert air like a rusty blade. "We know you're hiding behind that tree like some yellow-bellied snake." Nash closed his eyes for a heartbeat, remembering another day, another standoff. 6 months ago when that same voice had ordered his execution in Tombstone's dusty Main Street. He'd been on his knees, hands bound, watching his own death approach in slow motion. Then she'd appeared, a shadow in leather and steel, bandana pulled high, eyes like green. Fire above the crimson cloth, Briar Maddox. The most wanted outlaw in 3 territories, and the woman who'd saved his worthless hide without asking for so much as a thank you. The memory burned clear as desert noon. Her Winchester barking death from the hotel balcony, Crane's men scattering like tumbleweeds, and that red bandana catching a bullet meant for Nash's skull. She'd bled through the fabric, yet still managed to untie his bonds and whisper, "This makes us even for nothing, Marshall. Don't go thinking it means more." But it had meant more. Everything, in fact. Now she was the one in chains, locked in Marlowe's iron cage wagon like some wild animal destined for slaughter. Through the gaps in the wooden slats, Nash could see her dark hair spilling over defiant shoulders, her wrists raw from struggling against the rope. Even captured, Briar Maddox looked ready to tear the world apart with her bare hands. "You got 10 seconds, lawman." Marlowe called again. His voice carried that particular brand of cruelty that came from years of watching hope die in other men's eyes. "Then we start cutting pieces off your lady friend." Nash's jaw clenched. Lady friend. If only it were that simple. The truth was messier than desert wind, more complicated than the tangled history between them. Briar Maddox wasn't his anything. She was thunder and lightning wrapped in human form, a force of nature that answered to no man's call. She'd saved him once, disappeared into legend the next morning, and haunted his dreams ever since he'd spent months tracking her movements across the territory. Not to arrest her. Hell, half the crimes pinned to her name were committed by men trading on her reputation. He'd tracked her because something in those green eyes had spoken to the hollow place in his chest where his heart used to beat steady. And sure, before the war, before he'd worn the badge, before he'd learned that sometimes the law and justice were strangers to each other, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a canvas of red earth and blue sky broken only by the skeletal remains of Joshua trees. You can almost taste the silence here, thick and heavy as honey, broken only by the nervous snorting of horses and the creak of leather saddles. "Time's up." Marlowe's laughter carried on the wind like a coyote's howl. Nash heard the distinctive sound of a blade being drawn from its sheath, metal singing against leather. Death preparing to dance, he stepped out from behind the oak. "Freeze." The word cracked like a whip across the wasteland. "I'll trade for her." 12 guns swung toward him, but Nash kept his eyes fixed on Marlowe. Crane. The man sat his black stallion like a king surveying his domain, all silver conchos and polished leather, his face carved from the same unforgiving stone as the maces rising in the distance. A scar ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, courtesy of Briar's knife during their last encounter. Well, well. Marlowe's smile revealed teeth stained brown from tobacco and meanness. "Marshall Nash Hawthorne, walking into my parlor like a lamb to slaughter. What you off-airin', lawman?" Nash raised his hands slowly, never breaking eye contact. His badge caught the afternoon sun, throwing brief diamonds of light across the hardpan. "Me. Straight trade. Let her go. Take me instead." The silence stretched taut as a hangman's rope. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. From the cage wagon came a sound that might have been laughter or a sob. Briar's voice, rough as whiskey and twice as dangerous. "You fool. You beautiful, stupid fool." Marlowe's eyes glittered like a snake's before it strikes. "That outlaw girl seems dangerous, Marshall. What makes you think she's worth your hide?" Nash thought of crimson fabric torn by bullets, of green eyes fierce with defiance, of the hollow ache that had lived in his chest since the morning she'd vanished like morning mist. The bandana had been more than cloth. It had been a promise written in blood and desperation, that a promise he was finally ready to keep. Because, Nash said, his voice carrying across the desert like a prayer, some debts can only be paid with everything you got. But as Marlowe's grin widened, Nash caught a glimpse of movement in the rocks above, a flash of silver that didn't belong to any gun he recognized. The sound came first, a low whistle, like wind through a canyon, followed by the distinctive crack of a rifle shot echoing off stone walls. One of Marlowe's men, a bearded giant named Cassius Dean, toppled from his saddle, clutching his shoulder and cursing up a storm that would make a preacher weep. "Sniper!" someone shouted. Chaos erupted like a kicked anthill. Horses reared and bucked. Men dove for cover behind rocks and sagebrush, and gunfire erupted from 3 different directions. Nash hit the dirt as bullets whined overhead, tasting dust and opportunity in equal measure. Through the mayhem, he caught sight of a figure, moving with fluid grace across the ridge line, dark hair streaming behind like a war banner, a rifle in steady hands. For a heartbeat, his pulse hammered with impossible hope, but the build was wrong. Too tall, too lean. This wasn't Briar's rescue attempt. Koa Rivers, Marlowe snarled, pressing himself flat against his horse's neck as another shot punched a hole in his hat brim. Should have known that half-breed bounty hunter would stick his nose where it don't belong. Nash had heard tales of Koa Rivers, the Cherokee tracker who could red sign like scripture and shoot the wings off a fly at 200 yards. What he hadn't heard was why Rivers would risk his neck for an outlaw and a washed-up marshal. The answer came in Briar's voice, cutting through the gunfire like a blade through silk. Koa? The keys on Marlowe's belt. So she knew the bounty hunter. Of course she did. Briar Maddox collected dangerous people the way other women collected China dolls, carefully, and with an eye toward future utility. Another rifle crack, and the lock on the cage wagon exploded in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Briar kicked the door open with both boots, her bound hands already working at the rope around her wrists. Even in captivity, she moved like liquid lightning, all controlled violence and predatory grace. "Kill them all," Marlowe roared, drawing his ivory-handled peacemaker. Every last one. The desert erupted in smoke and thunder. Nash rolled behind a boulder, his mind racing through possibilities like cards in a riverboat gambler's hands. 6 bullets in his gun, maybe a dozen men left standing, and 2 allies he couldn't entirely trust. The mathematics still looked grim, but now they had a fighting chance that he rose from cover, drew a bead on the nearest gunman, a thin scarecrow of a man called Soleil Baxter, and squeezed the trigger. The Colt bucked in his hand, and Baxter spun like a child's top before hitting the dirt. 5 bullets left. Across the battlefield, Briar had freed herself and was making a run for the horses. She moved in a crouch, using the cage wagon for cover, her dark eyes scanning for threats with the cold efficiency of a born killer. Nash found himself holding his breath as she darted between patches of cover, each step taking her further from Marlowe's immediate reach. "She's getting away," one of the gang members shouted. "Let her run," Marlowe called back, his voice carrying a note of cruel satisfaction. "Ain't nowhere to go in this desert, 'cept back to us." But Nash knew better. Briar Maddox didn't run. She retreated tactically, like a general drawing the enemy into a trap. Even now, he could see her circling wide, using the terrain to mask her movement. She was hunting, not fleeing. That a shadow fell across him, and Nash looked up to see Alina Hendricks emerging from behind a cluster of mesquite. Marlowe's lieutenant was a woman carved from nightmares. Pale hair pulled back severe, eyes like winter ice, and a pair of match Colts that had sent more men to Boot Hill than cholera. "End of the line, Marshal," she said, thumbs working back the hammers with practiced ease. Nash stared death in the face and thought of red fabric stained with sacrifice, of promises written in blood and sealed with silence. Behind Alina, the desert stretched endless and beautiful, painted in shades of amber and gold by the dying sun. This was how it would end, then. Not in a blaze of glory, but in dust and regret, with the taste of what might have been bitter on his tongue, but just. As Alina's fingers tightened on the triggers, The world exploded in crimson fire. The crimson fire wasn't flame. It was Briar Maddox's bandana, whipping through the air like a scarlet banner as she vaulted over a boulder and drove her shoulder into Alina Hendrix's ribs. The two women went down in a tangle of limbs and lethal intent, rolling across the hardpan in a deadly embrace. Nash didn't waste the reprieve. He put a bullet through the chest of a gunman taking aim at Koa Rivers, then dove for new cover as. Return fire chewed chunks from the rock where his head had been. For bullets left, and the day was far from one. Briar. Alina's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with pain and fury. The blonde killer had rolled on top, her hands wrapped around Briar's throat, squeezing with methodical precision. You always were too clever for your own good. But Briar Maddox hadn't survived 3 years as the most wanted outlaw in the territory by playing fair. Her knee came up hard, finding the soft space between Alina's ribs, and as the other woman gasped and loosened her grip, Briar's teeth found the tender flesh of Alina's wrist. Alina screamed, a sound like a mountain cat in rage, and jerked back. Blood ran down her arm in crimson rivulets, stark against her pale skin. Savage, Alina hissed, drawing a knife from her boot with her good hand. Survivor, Briar corrected, rolling away just as the blade split air where her throat had been. From his position behind the rocks, Nash watched the deadly dance with his heart hammering against his ribs. You can feel the violence crackling in the air like heat lightning, each movement between the women a conversation written in steel and desperation. Briar moved like water, flowing around Alina's attacks, using her smaller size and quicker reflexes to stay one step ahead of the blade. But survival had its costs. Nash could see exhaustion creeping into Briar's movements, the subtle slowing. That came from months of running, weeks of poor food, and little sleep. Alina pressed her advantage, driving forward with the single-minded focus of a predator sensing wounded prey. Another rifle shot from the ridge announced Koa River's continued presence in the fight. This time the bullet took down a man Nash didn't recognize. Young, maybe 20, with the soft look of someone new to the outlaw life. The boy hit the ground clutching his leg and crying for his mother. Damn that breed, Marlowe roared, snapping off 3 quick shots toward the ridge. Cassius, take 2 men and flush him out. But Cassius Dean was in no condition to take orders. The big man sat propped against a wagon wheel, pressing his bandana against the hole in his shoulder, his face gray with blood loss and shock. The men who might have followed his lead were scattered, pinned down by River's deadly accurate fire. Nash saw his chance. With Marlowe's attention focused on the sniper, he broke from cover and sprinted toward the women's fight. Alina had backed, Briar against the cage wagon, the knife weaving silver patterns in the air between them. Nowhere left to run. Outlaw. Alina panted, blood still dripping from her wounded wrist. Who's running? Briar's smile was all teeth and dangered. That's when Nash noticed what Alina had missed. Briar's bound hands had found something during their rolling fight. A piece of broken chain from the wagon lock, maybe 2 feet long and heavy as a man's forearm. Alina lunged with the knife. Briar sidestepped, bringing the chain up in a vicious arc that caught the blonde woman across the temple with a sound like an axe biting wood. Alina's eyes rolled back, and she crumpled to the dust without a sound. Took you long enough, Briar said, not even breathing hard as Nash reached her side. Been a mite busy, Nash replied, cutting her bonds with Alina's dropped knife. His fingers brushed hers as he worked, and something electric passed between them. Recognition, gratitude, and something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. The bandana, he said quietly, nodding toward the crimson fabric now tied around her throat. Still wearing it. Briar's hand went to the cloth, her fingers tracing the bullet hole that had nearly cost her life. Seemed ashamed to waste good fabric. But her eyes said something different. They said the bandana was a promise, a connection, a thread binding. Their fates together across all the miles and months between. Touching reunion. Marlowe's voice cut through the moment like a rusty blade. But this dance ain't over yet. The outlaw leader stood 20 paces away, his ivory-handled peacemaker trained on the space between Nash and Briar. His remaining men, maybe 6 or 7 still standing, had formed a rough semicircle, cutting off any escape toward the horses. Here's how this plays out, Marlowe continued, his scarred face twisted in a grin that held no humor. You drop your iron, Marshall, and maybe I'll make it quick for both of you. Nash's hand hovered over his gun butt. 3 bullets left. 7 men. The mathematics hadn't improved much, but Briar stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance that made Nash's chest tight with something that might have been pride or might have been terror. Or here's another idea, Marlowe, she said, her voice carrying across the desert like honey over broken glass. You let us walk, and maybe I don't tell your boys about the silver mine. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Marlowe's grin faltered. What mine? The one you've been keeping secret from your own gang. Briar's smile was sharper than any blade. The one you found 3 months ago up in Widow's Canyon. The one that's got you planning to disappear with all that, or while your loyal followers think you're still robbing stages for coffee money. The men shifted restlessly, hands drifting toward weapons as suspicion bloomed in their eyes like poison flowers. Nash felt the balance of power shift, subtle as a change in the wind direction. She's lying, Marlowe said, but there was sweat beating on his forehead despite the desert chill. Am I? Briar pulled something from her pocket, a chunk of rock that gleamed with silver veins. Found this in your saddlebags yesterday, before your boys so rudely interrupted my breakfast. The revelation hit the gang like a physical blow. Angry voices rose, accusations flew, and suddenly Marlowe Crane was facing down his own men instead of his prisoners. But in the chaos of betrayal and rage, Nash missed the shadow moving behind them until it was too late. The gunshot came from directly behind, and Briar Maddox crumpled to the desert floor with crimson spreading across her shirt like spilled wine. Time fractured like glass hitting stone. Nash's world narrowed to the spreading crimson stain on Briar's shirt, the way her green eyes widened in shock, the soft sound she made as her knees buckled. Behind her stood a ghost from his past, Deputy Tom Sterling, his former partner, the man who'd supposedly died in a Comanche raid 2 years ago. Hello, Nash, Sterling said, smoke still curling from the barrel of his Winchester. Been a long time. The words hit Nash harder than any bullet. Tom Sterling, steady, reliable Tom, who'd saved his life a dozen times, who'd stood beside him through the worst the frontier could offer. Tom, whose badge Nash had mailed to his widow along with a letter full of lies about heroism and honor. You're dead, Nash whispered, his voice barely audible over the ringing in his ears. Only on paper. Sterling's smile held no warmth, just the cold satisfaction of a trap finally sprung. Amazing what a man can accomplish when the world thinks he's buried, Briar groaned, pressing her hand against the wound in her shoulder. The bullet had passed clean through, Nash realized with relief sharp as broken glass. Not fatal, but enough to ground her like a bird with a broken wing. Tom. Nash's hand moved toward his gun, then stopped as Sterling's rifle swung to cover him. None of that now. Sterling stepped closer, keeping the weapon trained on Nash's chest. We got catching up to do, partner. Like how you left me for dead when the Comanche came calling. The memory hit Nash like a physical blow. Adobe Wells. The ambush. Sterling going down with 3 arrows in his back while Nash fought his way to the horses. He tried to go back, tried to reach his partner, but the war party had been too strong, too many. I came back for you, Nash said, the words tasting like ashes. Your body was gone. I thought, you thought wrong. Sterling's voice carried 2 years of buried rage. The Comanche kept me alive, traded me to the Kiowa. Took me 8 months to escape, and when I finally made it back to civilization, what did I find? Marshall Nash Hawthorne, hero of Adobe Wells. The man who single-handedly held off 30 warriors. Around them, Marlowe's gang had forgotten their silver mine betrayal, focusing instead on this new development. The outlaw leader himself watched with calculating eyes, clearly trying to figure out how this complication might serve his interests. That ain't how it happened, Nash said. But even as the words left his mouth, he remembered the newspaper stories, the way the marshal's office had twisted the tale into something more palatable than the truth. A hero's stand looked better in print than a desperate retreat that left a good man behind. Doesn't matter now, Sterling said. What matters is payment. Eye for an eye, Nash. You left me for dead, so I'm returning the favor. But Briar Maddox, bleeding and hurt as she was, still had fight left in her. From her position on the ground, she looked up at Sterling with eyes like green flame and spoke just loud enough for Marlowe's men to hear. "Funny thing about men who fake their own deaths," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. "They usually got something to hide. Something worth dying for, you might say." Sterling's jaw tightened. "Shut your mouth, outlaw." "Like maybe a certain robbery in Tucson," Breyer continued, pressing her advantage like a riverboat gambler with aces up her sleeve. "The one where a marshal's deputy disappeared the same day as 30,000 in silver bullion." You can feel the tension shift again, subtle as sand blown by desert wind. Marlowe's remaining men exchanged glances, their mercenary minds already calculating angles and opportunities. "She's lying," Sterling said, but his voice carried less conviction than before. "Am I?" Breyer smiled through the pain, and Nash felt something fierce and proud bloom in his chest. Even wounded, even cornered, she was still the most dangerous person in the canyon. "Funny how you showed up here just when we were talking about silver mines. Almost like you've been watching Marlowe's operation, waiting for the right moment to make your move." The pieces clicked together in Nash's mind like the chambers of a well-oiled revolver. Sterling wasn't here for revenge, not entirely. He was here for the same reason vultures circled dying cattle: opportunity. "The Tucson job," Nash said slowly. "You didn't disappear at Adobe Wells. You ran after you stole that silver." Sterling's face went white beneath his desert tan. "That's a lie, is it?" Marlowe Crane's voice cut through the desert air like a whip crack. The outlaw leader was studying Sterling with new interest, his hand resting casual-like on his gun. "But, because if there's one thing I can't abide, it's a thief in my territory." The irony would have been funny if lives weren't hanging in the balance. Marlowe Crane, who'd robbed more banks than most men had hot dinners, taking offense at theft. But Sterling still held the rifle, and his desperation was making him dangerous. "Nobody moves," he shouted, swinging the barrel to cover the whole group. "I'll put bullets in all of you if I have to." That's when Koa Rivers made his presence known again. The Cherokee tracker had worked his way down from the ridge during the confrontation, silent as morning mist. Now he stood 30 feet behind Sterling, a throwing knife balanced in his raised hand. "Drop it," Rivers said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd never had to repeat himself. Sterling spun, bringing the rifle around, but Rivers was already in motion. The knife left his hand in a silver blur, taking Sterling through the gun arm and spinning the Winchester into the dust. Sterling screamed, clutching his wounded arm, and suddenly everyone was moving at once. Marlowe went for his gun, his remaining men following suit. Nash drew and fired in one smooth motion, putting a bullet through Marlowe's wrist before the outlaw leader could clear leather point. 2 bullets left. The desert erupted in gunfire again, but this time the fight was different. 3-sided instead of 2, with old loyalties shattered and new alliances forming on the fly. Nash found himself fighting alongside Rivers, their guns speaking in deadly harmony as they carved through Marlowe's confused and demoralized gang. When the smoke cleared, 5 men lay still in the dust. Marlowe knelt clutching his shattered wrist, his ivory-handled peacemaker forgotten in the dirt. Sterling sat propped against a rock, Rivers' knife still pinning his arm, his face gray with shock and blood loss. But it was Breyer who commanded Nash's attention. She dragged herself upright, her back against the cage wagon, the red bandana now pressed against her shoulder wound. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear, and when she looked at him, Nash saw something there that made his breath catch in his throat. "Well," she said, her voice rougher than usual, but still carrying that hint of dangerous humor. "That was educational." Nash was about to respond when the ground beneath them began to tremble, and a sound like distant thunder rolled across the desert from the direction of Widow's Canyon. The sound wasn't thunder, it was dynamite, and it was coming from Widow's Canyon, where Marlowe's secret silver mine carved its way into the mountain's heart. Nash felt the tremor through his boots, saw dust rising like a funeral shroud against the darkening sky. "What the hell?" Marlowe gasped, still cradling his shattered wrist. But Breyer's face had gone white as desert bone, and when she spoke, her voice carried a terror Nash had never heard before. "Flash flood. The dynamite must have hit an underground spring." The words hit Nash like a physical blow. flash floods in canyon country were death sentences written in water and stone. He'd seen what they could do, walls of liquid fury that could move boulders like pebbles and strip flesh from bone in heartbeats. How long? He asked, already knowing the answer would be measured in minutes, not hours. Depends on how much water was backed up, Briar said, struggling to her feet with Rivers' help. But we need to get to high ground. Now, Koa Rivers was already scanning the canyon walls, his tracker's eyes reading the landscape like a book of life and death. There, he said, pointing to a narrow ledge maybe 60 feet up the eastern wall. Old mining trail. Should be above the floodline. Nash looked at the path Rivers indicated, a ribbon of stone barely wide enough for a man to walk, switchbacking up the canyon face like a snake's trail. Under normal circumstances, it would be a treacherous climb. With wounded people and limited time, it might be impossible. I can't make that climb, Sterling said, his voice thick with pain and the certainty of death. Rivers' knife was still pinned through his arm, and blood loss had left him gray-faced and shaking. Then you'll die here, Marlowe snarled, pushing himself upright with his good hand. I ain't waitin' for no yellow-belly thief. But Nash was already moving, hauling Sterling to his feet despite every instinct screaming that the man deserved whatever fate the canyon delivered. Nobody gets left behind. Not again. Sterling's eyes widened with something that might have been gratitude or might have been disbelief. Nash, save it. Nash cut him off. We'll settle accounts if we live through this. The rumbling from the canyon was getting louder, and now Nash could hear something else beneath it, the distant roar of rushing water. You can almost smell the change in the air, the sudden humidity that meant tons of mountain runoff were bearing down on them like the wrath of God himself. Briar had torn strips from her shirt to bind her shoulder wound, the crimson bandana now wrapped around her throat like a badge of defiance. Despite the pain etched in every line of her face, she moved with purposeful grace, gathering weapons and supplies from the scattered remains of the gunfight. Briar, Nash called, but she was already shaking her head. Don't, she said, her voice carrying that tone he'd learned meant arguing would be useless. Don't you dare try to carry me up that cliff like some helpless flower. I've climbed worse, with bullet holes in worse places. Nash bit back his response, recognizing the pride that kept her upright when lesser souls would have collapsed. Instead, he turned to Rivers, who was methodically retrieving his knife from Sterling's arm. Can you get him up there? Nash asked, nodding toward the wounded deputy. Rivers studied Sterling with calculating eyes, then shrugged. Man wants to live, he'll find a way to climb. The Cherokee tracker's philosophy was simple and harsh, but it was also the kind of truth that kept people breathing in country that killed the weak without mercy. The first drops of water appeared around the canyon bend. Not the flood itself, but the advanced scouts, muddy rivulets that spoke of destruction following close behind. Nash felt his chest tighten with the familiar weight of responsibility, the burden of other people's lives hanging on his decisions. Move, he shouted, and suddenly everyone was scrambling toward the eastern wall. The climb began in desperation and continued in agony. The old mining trail was treacherous even in daylight, carved by men who'd valued speed over safety. Loose stones shifted underfoot, handholds crumbled at crucial moments, and the growing roar from the canyon floor reminded them that time was their enemy as much as gravity. Nash climbed behind Briar, close enough to catch her if she fell, watching the way she favored her wounded shoulder without letting it slow her progress. Blood had soaked through her makeshift bandage, leaving crimson smears on the rock where she'd braced herself, but her movements remained sure and purposeful. Above them, Rivers moved like his namesake, fluid, adaptable, finding paths where none seemed to exist. He'd taken point, testing each section of trail before the others committed their weight to it. Sterling was the weak link, as Nash had known he would be. The deputy's face was gray with blood loss and pain, his wounded arm hanging useless at his side. Twice he stumbled, nearly taking Nash down with him, and each time Nash hauled him upright and pushed him forward. What? Sterling gasped during one brief rest, his eyes searching Nash's face for answers. After what I did, why save me? Nash looked down at the man who'd been his partner, his friend, the closest thing to a brother he'd ever known. Because that's what partners do. Even when they're too stupid to remember it themselves. The sound of rushing water was growing louder, and now Nash could see it. A brown wall of destruction sweeping around the canyon bend, carrying trees and boulders and the promise of death for anything caught in its path. The flood was moving, faster than a running horse, devouring everything in its reach. Faster, rivers shouted from above, but they were already moving as fast as they dared on the crumbling trail point 50 feet from the ledge. Marlowe's nerve broke. The outlaw leader, weakened by blood loss and consumed by the selfishness that had defined his life, made a grab for higher ground that sent him sliding backward down the trail. Nash lunged without thinking, catching Marlowe's good wrist just as the man went over the edge. For a moment they hung there, Nash's feet braced against the trail, Marlowe's weight threatening to pull them both into the churning death below. "Let me go," Marlowe gasped, his scarred face twisted with something that might have been regret. "Ain't worth dying for a man like me." Nash looked into the eyes of the man who'd caused so much pain, so much suffering, and saw something unexpected there. Not evil, but emptiness. A hollow place where a soul should have been. "Maybe not," Nash said, straining against the weight. "But I am." That's when Briar's hand closed over his wrist, adding her strength to his, and together they hauled Marlowe crane up from the abyss. They reached the ledge with seconds to spare, collapsing onto the narrow shelf of rock as the flood roared past. Below them, like a living thing made of mud and fury. The sound was deafening, a continuous thunder that seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. Nash watched trees older than his grandfather get snapped like twigs, boulders the size of houses tumble like dice in the brown torrent. For long minutes, nobody spoke. They simply breathed, grateful for the simple miracle of air in their lungs and stone beneath their backs. The ledge was maybe 20 feet long and 6 feet deep, cramped quarters for 5 people who'd been trying to kill each other an hour ago, but it was sanctuary. Sterling sat with his back against the canyon wall, River's knife wound bound with strips torn from his shirt. The bleeding had stopped, but his face was still gray with shock and blood loss. "Nash," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the flood's roar. "About Tucson." "Later," Nash said, but without the hard edge that had been there before. Saving a man's life had a way of changing perspectives, even when that man was a thief and a liar. Marlowe Crane huddled at the far end of the ledge, cradling his shattered wrist and staring down at the destruction below with something like awe. The outlaw leader who'd terrorized 3 territories looked smaller now, diminished by proximity to forces beyond his control, but it was Briar who commanded Nash's attention. She sat with her knees drawn up, the crimson bandana bright against her throat, watching the flood with eyes that held depths he was only beginning to fathom. Blood had soaked through her bandage again, but she seemed oblivious to the pain. "You saved him," she said, not looking at Nash, but somehow making it clear she was talking to him. "Marlowe, after everything he's done, you risked your life too. Pull him up." Nash studied her profile, trying to read the emotion in her voice. Seemed like the right thing to do. The right thing. Briar's laugh held no humor. "You know what the right thing got my family? A burned-out homestead and 3 graves in ground too hard to dig proper." This was new territory. Briar Maddox had never spoken of her past, never let slip the wounds that had forged her into the outlaw the territories feared. Nash found himself holding his breath, afraid that any movement might break the spell. "Bandits came through when I was 16, she continued, her voice steady as stone. "Pa tried to reason with them. Said we didn't have much, but we'd share what we could. Ma even offered to cook them a meal." Her hand went to the bandana, fingers tracing the bullet hole. "The right thing got them killed, and me left with nothing but anger and this piece of cloth that caught a bullet meant for a stranger's heart." The pieces clicked together in Nash's mind. "Your mother's bandana. Last thing she gave me. Told me to cover my face. Run for the hills. Don't look back." Briar's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Been running ever since, I suppose. Until that day in Tombstone when I saw a man about to die for doing the right thing, and something in me just couldn't let it happen again." Nash reached out slowly, his fingers covering hers where they rested on the crimson fabric. "That's why you saved me. Not because it was right, but because you couldn't stand to watch someone else pay the price for decency." "Maybe." Briar's eyes met his, and in them Nash saw something that made his chest tight with possibility. Or maybe I just saw something worth saving for once. The flood was beginning to subside, its roar dropping from a scream to a growl. But the destruction below was complete. Where the canyon floor had been, only churning brown water remained, carrying the debris of Marlowe's camp toward the distant river. Well, Koa Rivers said, breaking the silence with characteristic understatement. That was interesting. The Cherokee tracker was studying the far wall of the canyon, his sharp eyes reading signs that others might miss. There's another trail, he said, pointing to a barely visible path that switchbacked up the opposite wall. Leads to the main road. Be a long walk back to town, but it's better than staying here till the buzzards come calling. Nash looked around at their unlikely group. An outlaw with a bullet wound, a thieving deputy with a knife hole in his arm, a bounty hunter who'd risked his neck for strangers, and a killer who'd found something like mercy at the last moment. Not exactly the company he'd expected to keep when he'd pinned on his badge that morning. What happens now? Sterling asked, his voice rough with exhaustion and shame. Nash considered the question. By rights, he should arrest Sterling for the Tucson robbery, haul Breyer back to stand trial for her crimes, and see Marlowe hanged for murder and worse. That was what the law demanded, what his badge required. But sometimes the law and justice were strangers to each other, and sometimes mercy was the only currency that mattered. Now, Nash looked at each of them in turn. Now we figure out how to live with what we've done and what we've learned. Sterling nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. The deputy would face his crimes, but as a man seeking redemption, rather than a fugitive running from truth. Marlowe said nothing, but his eyes held a hollowness that spoke of a man confronting the emptiness of his own soul. Whether that would lead to change or deeper darkness remained to be seen. Rivers simply shrugged, already planning his route down the canyon wall. For the Cherokee tracker, this had been just another job, another day in a life measured by horizons and trails. But Breyer was looking at Nash with something in her eyes that might have been hope, might have been fear, might have been the recognition that some partnerships were written in blood and sealed with trust earned in the crucible of desperate choices. The bandana, Nash said quietly, his voice meant for her alone. What will you do with it now? Breyer's hand went to the crimson fabric, her fingers tracing the bullet hole that had brought them together. For a moment, Nash thought she might untie it, might let the desert wind carry it away like a promise fulfilled. Instead, she smiled. The first genuine smile he'd ever seen from her, bright as sunrise over the mountains. Keep wearing it, I reckon, she said. Never know when it might catch another bullet meant for a fool who thinks doing right is worth dying for. And as the sun set over the flooded canyon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Nash Hawthorne found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, some promises were worth keeping forever. Well now, partners, that there was quite a ride through the desert. If this tale of bandanas and bullets, floods and foolish hearts struck your fancy, give it a like and let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more Wild West adventures that'll keep you on the edge of your saddle. Speaking of adventures, we're mighty curious. Where in this big wide world are you watching from today? Drop a comment and tell us your hometown.